Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at Java's variables and data types. So let's get started. We've got three learning goals today. First is that you can identify and describe Java's primitive data types. The second is that you can declare and initialize primitive variables with proper naming conventions. And finally, we need to be able to explain the behavior of the final modifier. From prior experience, you probably already know that in programming, we use variables to store pieces of information. Here we see an example of creating a variable in Java. We start out with the data type, which specifies what sort of information we want our variable to hold. The word int means positive and negative whole numbers, and as we go through the rest of this lesson, we'll see other types that we can use. Next, we specify the identifier for the variable. This is basically the variable's name, or how we will refer to it in the code. Now, at this point, we could be done with declaring our variable, but we choose to keep going and give our variable an initial value. The equal sign means assignment. It means that we're going to change the value of score, and 0 is the value we're changing it to. So in this line, we're creating an integer variable called score, and we're assigning it an initial value of 0. Note that Java statements, pretty much all of them, will end with semicolons, which is probably something you've seen before in programming. Declaring and initializing are two words that are used very frequently when we're talking about variables, and it's important to understand the difference. When we declare a variable, that really is talking about the process of creating the variable, whereas initializing is giving it its initial value. And you can see in this example, we are doing both of those on the same line of code. To help you understand the difference further, here's the same declaration and initialization, but done in two separate lines. On the first line, we create the variable, and on the second line, we give it its initial value. Now that we know how to make a variable in Java, let's spend some time talking about the types of variables we can make. Specifically in this lesson, we're going to focus on the primitives, which are the basic data types built into Java. And the primitives include integers, doubles, booleans, and characters. Integers and doubles are Java's numeric types. Ints hold positive and negative whole numbers, while doubles can hold a decimal point. So it's important to realize that the number 5 is an int, but the number 5.0 is a double. Boolean variables can only hold the value true or false, and they're really useful for situations where we want to keep track of basically a yes or no question. Is our game over? True or false? Are we logged in? True or false? We'll do a lot with Booleans when we get to Unit 3. The last primitive data type in Java is a character, and characters hold single letters or symbols like the letter A or question mark. Character values are always surrounded by single quotation marks, and these are not the same as strings, which can hold multiple characters and are surrounded by double quotes. This table summarizes Java's primitive types. We have int that hold positive and negative whole numbers. We have doubles that also can include a decimal point. We have booleans that can be true and false, and we have chars, which are single characters. There actually are a few other primitive types besides these, but these are the ones that are going to be relevant to this course. It may surprise you to know that the primitives are the only data types that are built into Java. Now, that doesn't mean we can't create other types of variables, but those other types were actually created by programmers using primitives. So for example, in Java, we can make string variables, but strings aren't baked into Java. A programmer created string variables using the char primitive. In addition to variables, we can also create constants in Java. Now, variables can be changed at any point. In fact, that's what the word variable means. It can change. For example, if we made an int x equal to 7 and then we added 1 to it and printlined the result, it would printline 8 because 7 plus 1 is 8. On the other hand, constants cannot be changed once they're initialized, and we create them with the modifier final. So if you take a look at the example, we say final int con equals 7. And then if I try to add 1 to it, it will actually produce an error because once the value of the constant is set, you cannot change it. The entire purpose of a constant is a situation where we want to make sure that the variable can't accidentally be changed, where we want its value to be permanent. And in those situations, we declare our variable with the modifier final to create that constant. Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about naming conventions for our variables and constants. A naming convention basically is a way of naming something that will make us consistent with all other Java programmers in the world. So starting with variables, variables should always be named using lower camel case. And basically what that means is that variable names start with a lowercase letter, but then every word after that starts with a capital. So in the example, my really cool variable, notice that every word besides the first one starts with a capital letter. Now, moving on to constants, constants are always named in all caps. And this is helpful because when you see a variable in somebody else's code that's all caps, you'll know it's a constant. So you are expected, as we're writing our Java code, to follow these naming conventions. Time to check your understanding. Take a look at the 2 questions on your screen. Pause the video, come up with an answer, and when you're ready, resume and we'll talk about the answers. For number 1, the correct answer is B. String is not one of the primitive data types. For number 2, the code technically works, but proper naming conventions were not followed. Constants should be written with all capitalized identifiers, and variables should use lower camel case, as shown. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to explain the purpose of Java's primitive data types, including int, double char, and boolean. You should be able to declare and initialize primitive variables with proper naming conventions. And finally, you should be able to explain the behavior of the final modifier.